Okay, and now I'm going to introduce us. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're looking forward to connecting with you. On behalf of the Swampscott Conservancy, I'd like to welcome everybody this evening for joining us tonight. My name is Colleen Hitchcock, and along with Salem Sound Coast Watch, the Abbott Library in Marblehead, and the Swampscott Public Library, we're super excited to bring you Dr. Tallamy tonight to speak to us about bringing nature home, nature's best hope, connecting us with native plants, and the part that we can play in welcoming biodiversity into our communities. Before we get started, and as people are continuing to join us from the waiting room, I just want to take this opportunity to share a little bit about the Swampscott Conservancy. And again, to just ask that throughout the initial part of this evening's event, if you could please remain muted. You can unmute during the Q&A. Once we get to that point in the evening, I'll ask you to use your virtual hand to raise your hand so that we can ask questions. And throughout the evening, you can always drop questions into the chat, and we will also try to address those during the Q&A as well. So if you're afraid that you're going to forget your question, you can feel free to drop it in the chat with us, and we can proceed that way as well. For those who are not familiar with the Swampscott Conservancy, we are a local nonprofit here in Swampscott, Massachusetts. We have a four-pronged mission of education, and in normal times, our education events are face-to-face, habitat improvement, and you can see some images there from our town hall pollinator garden, our native plant garden, kind of close to tonight's topic. We are also working on some small restoration projects around the middle school. We also do a lot of citizen science, and anybody who's interacted with me knows that iNaturalist is the way to go, and we can share some more on that later this evening. And we like to connect with our community and do community building through walks and birding outings, etc. We hope that for those who are not familiar yet with the Conservancy, that you will take the time to become part of the Swampscott Conservancy's community. You can do so by joining us for one of our monthly meetings. Next week, we have one on the 31st. Join us for another education event. We tend to have one every month or so. Join us on iNaturalist doing citizen science, or volunteer with one of our projects, and you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. On behalf of the Abbott Library, I just want to take a quick moment to thank them for their partnership on this event. The Abbott Library in Marblehead is especially appreciative of this opportunity to join in sponsoring this event. The Abbott Library previously has hosted Dr. Tallamy about 10 years ago in 2011 to talk on his earlier book, Bringing Nature Home. And they also wanted to share this upcoming event that they have this upcoming event on seasonal wildlife adaptations with Katie Broder. And we will be dropping that link in the chat if you would like to bookmark that and attend that event later this month. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Barbara Warren from Salem Sound Coast Watch to share a little bit about their mission and some of their upcoming opportunities.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And it's a pleasure to be able to collaborate with groups like the Swampscott Conservancy and the libraries, Abbott Library, and all the other wonderful groups that are in the area on the North Shore working to protect the environment. So Salem Sound Coast Watch is sort of focused on the water, but when you focus on the water, you got to look at how people are using the land. So Dr. Tallamy's talk tonight is so important for all of us to hear. Wonderful message. And now with the climate crisis, we even need to hear this even louder, because biodiversity is a critical part of solving this very serious problem. So we do all the things that the Conservancy does. And so those programs could be replicated here on our slide, but we like working together and just getting all of you involved in some way to protect our rivers and the estuaries and oceans. And that really means doing something in your own backyard, in your community. Those are the lands, the watershed that's connected to our coastal waters. You can reach us at salemsound.org to find out about our events. And we also have the Greenscapes program, which is environmentally friendly landscaping to preserve water And we, again, do all these messagings as about how to take care of your property. And that's at greenscapes.org. We have 25 communities on the North Shore that are part of that Greenscapes. So thank you very much, and looking forward to this immensely tonight.
Thanks, Barbara. I have to say, Sound Coast Watch is one of our favorite organizations to partner up with.
Thank you.
Before we get going, I'm going to make one more announcement, and that is to also thank the Environmental Studies program at Brandeis University, who supports the Conservancy through the use of Zoom for events such as this, and to also explicitly call out Lyle James, who is joining us this evening, who is helping to manage everybody in our room here tonight on Zoom. Brandeis Environmental Studies Programs is one of the sponsors of the City Nature Challenge here in the Boston area. And if you haven't heard of the CNC before, I encourage you to check out what the City Nature Challenge is. It's upcoming at the end of April and will run from April 30th through May 3rd. It's a great opportunity where everybody can get involved and help to document the nature around us. And that information in that documentation becomes valuable data that scientists can use to start to understand how our landscape is changing around us. And again, just one last thank you again to the Swampscott Library for also joining us in these efforts. And with that, I will now introduce our speaker. And so we are extremely grateful and excited to be hosting Dr. Tallamy this evening. Doug Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He has authored 104 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways that insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home: How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published by Timber Press in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Darke, was published in 2014. Oops.
Oh, did I just take it away from you?
You did. And he's apparently very.
Oh, we don't need any more of that. I didn't realize you were
going.
reading that. I'm just so anxious to get going here.
It's all good. I guess at this point, I will just hand it right over to you, Doug. Thank you for joining us this evening, and please take it away.
I'm sorry, I've never done that before. All right, well, I don't know what she was going to say, but thank you anyway, Colleen. I want to talk to you tonight about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to return to what happened, not this fall, but a year ago fall. We had what we call an oak mast. All the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I am easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. It first chewed a hole for its head, then it forced its head through, and then it forced its entire body through. It was a tight fit, made it look like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plopped down though. That is a very dangerous time for this larva because it's very good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by squirming and wiggling below the surface of the soil. It takes about 30 seconds and down it goes. And once it's underneath the soil, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. Females take those mouth parts, chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that is how the larvae gets to the center of the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Well, red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Well, after they've left the acorn, that of course leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils inside of acorns. And if they find a new acorn freshly evacuated, they are excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody, time to move. They get busy. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, everybody works very hard. In about 30 minutes, they move the entire colony into the new acorn. Then they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? My point is that is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They will take an acorn, fly up to a mile from the parent tree, tap it below the surface of the ground. Of course, the idea is they're going to go get it during the wintertime and eat it for winter food. But a single jay can bury up to 4,500 acorns in the fall. And they don't remember where all of them are. So a single jay can actually plant somewhere around 3,000 oak trees every single year. Found out this year what is pollinating witch hazel. Witch hazel, of course, is a small tree or tall shrub that blooms in the fall, well after frost. All the leaves are down. And it's always been a puzzle to me, what is pollinating witch hazel? But I went out once at night this year and found out it is winter moths. This is one of the winter moths, the bicolored sallow. They fly very late. I caught a bicolored sallow on Christmas Eve this year. So they turn out to be the primary pollinators of witch hazel. And I don't know whether witch hazel is blooming late to take advantage of winter moths or whether winter moths are flying late to take advantage of witch hazel. But at this point, they're taking advantage of each other in a very specialized relationship. You won't have breeding pileated woodpeckers anywhere near you if you don't have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only plant, the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common among our 4,000 species of native bees. About 13 species of native bees in New England, for example, can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead, and on and on and on. Nature really is a series of specialized relationships. Today, though, these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem today, of course, is that we can't leave it as it was because we haven't. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states it's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. That's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. We have paved it, of course, and otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done that? Well, I guess we thought the earth was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and we're being reminded about that on a regular basis now with major headlines like this one. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one. North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population. Now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, maybe in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report this as if it's just one more headline. I mean, they might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline. This is not an option, folks. Losing oxygen is not an option, and either is losing 1 million species. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those small efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, you Boston folks know who E.O. Wilson is, certainly the greatest entomologist of all times, Harvard emeritus at this point. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost insects, and he did it way back in 1987 in this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, and even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Good news is, though, that that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we are going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. They are totally dependent on nature. We're dependent on what we call ecosystem services, the things that keep us and everything else alive on the planet. These are just some of the things that plants deliver to us, like oxygen, pretty important. Clean water, also important. Plants slow the journey of fresh water to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important now. They're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, using the carbon in that molecule to build their own tissues, but then they also pump extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and lots of other critical things. What do animals give plants? Well, they provide pest control services for those plants. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds, and so on. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is not a good idea. It never was a good idea, but today it's a downright terrible idea because we've got so many people on the planet demanding ecosystem services. We've got 7.8, 7.9 billion people right now on the planet. We need more ecosystem services now than ever before. So taking huge areas of the planet out of production, just not a good idea. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with the planet that supports us. Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, who wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is, the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that for long periods, but by and large, our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, and we go to another place and spoil that as well. And Aldo knew that was not a sustainable relationship with the earth. So he had an idea, a dream really, that we humans were able to develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we needed to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and do all of those things. But he dreamt that we could actually learn to do those things gently enough that we did it without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic. What he never wrote about, though, is developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure where that was, but I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it is still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue this evening is that living with nature not only is an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually recreate it where there are a lot of people, because that is most everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. We can't ignore conservation on private property because most of certainly the US is privately owned, and really most of the land is. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned, about 75% of the entire country privately owned. If we ignore private property when we're doing conservation, we're going to fail, because then we'll only be working on areas that are too small and too isolated from each other again, to run the ecosystems we depend on. But there are a number of conservation options that we're not taking full advantage of right now, but we could be. How about power and pipeline rights-of-ways? There's 21 million acres in those types of landscapes. Railroad rights-of-ways, 3 million acres. Roadside rights-of-ways, another 17 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are big places. Then we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas and suburbia, our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those landscapes. If you add up just those areas, and you can think of others, that's 599 million acres where we could be doing very effective conservation, but right now we're not. How big is 599 million acres? It's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, plus Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, plus California, plus Texas. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation almost everywhere. So when I talk about conservation, I'm really talking about reconstructing the natural world where we have dismantled it. But we have to understand how it works. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the building blocks. We have to start with the powerhouse species that other species depend on. And there's two groups that we can't do without. We need those flowering plants, and we need the pollinators that allow those flowering plants to reproduce, because those are the plants, of course, that are capturing the energy from the sun, turning it into food. And then that food, of course, supports the rest of the animals. But if the food remains locked up in the leaves, if it doesn't get to the animals, then it's still a failed food web. And it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. That's something typically is insects. And caterpillars are transferring more energy to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes without a lot of caterpillars in them, most of the energy remains locked up in plant leaves, and you have a failed food web and a failed ecosystem. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That is the chickadee that's at my house right now. You've got black-capped chickadee. They're doing exactly the same thing. They're eating seeds during the wintertime. About 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but here's a citizen science project that one of my students recently completed. She put out a call, Ashley Kennedy put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season. The idea was that they would get pictures of the birds when they're carrying food to the nest. Excuse me. Then they're going to send those pictures to Ashley. She would identify the prey items in the beaks and then reconstruct the nestling diets of as many birds as she could in North America. Well, she got thousands of pictures and was able to reconstruct the nestling diets for 20 of the common bird families that we have. The green bars that you're looking at there were the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out of the system. Most of our birds wouldn't be able to reproduce. Something is special about caterpillars. What do you think it is? There's actually several things that are special about caterpillars. And one of them is very obvious. They're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's cuticle, made of chitin. It's undigestible. So birds don't want a lot of exoskeleton. And because the caterpillars are soft, they can stuff them down the throat of their offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. They take the beaker, it's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get a caterpillar? They are nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. Only plants make carotenoids. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of our diets. And that's why my wife, Cindy, makes sure that I have lots of carrots to get my beta carotene, and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene, lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. And when I eat those things, they stimulate my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a healthy immune system. Carotenoids are antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler, who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And he takes those luteins and he makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are they getting their carotenoids from? From the prey items that they eat, of course. But carotenoid content of various invertebrate prey is not at all equal. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of prey. Third bar is orthopteroids, things like grasshoppers, crickets, and katydids. Here's the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. Far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. Only the caterpillars are eating the green leaves. And here is the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. All of this and lots of other data suggest that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say that the birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough, or is 1 or 2 a day enough? Well, let's go back to those chickadees. We've got a lot of data on chickadees. No, 1 or 2 is not enough. This is how many caterpillars it takes for one clutch of chickadees to reach the point where they fledge. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on how many chicks are in the nest. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count that. And if you want chickadees breeding in your yard, and you do, because that's all that's left in so many places, we have to have that many caterpillars in our yards. The chickadees are foraging about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't landscape in a way that has that many caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like that is directly linked to bird decline. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. They were the ones that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial birds they looked at into 2 groups. The species that require insects at some part of their life history and the species that don't. So things like doves and finches can reproduce on seeds. They don't need insects. They actually gained a few numbers, but the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species in the last 50 years. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as insects go, so go our birds. So in an abundance of caution, let's conclude, if we want birds around and lots of other things that eat the insects that plants produce, we need to start landscaping in a way that creates those insects, particularly caterpillars. And that's a new goal for landscaping, because in the past, we've considered plants to be decorations. We didn't want anything to eat them. And as a matter of fact, we worked very hard to make sure there was nothing else in our landscapes, that they were essentially deadscapes. We're not going to do that anymore. Now we're going to plant in a way that attracts caterpillars. How do we do that? Well, you add caterpillars to your landscapes by adding the plants that support them, which seems easy enough, but there is a catch. And that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to choose the ones that do. And we have to be fussy about it because most of the insects that are out there are very fussy about what they can eat. The monarch butterfly is a perfect example. You can have all the buckthorn and all the crepe myrtle and all the boxwood and barberry and burning bush and any of the other Asian ornamentals that we put in our yard. And you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that is going to create a monarch butterfly is milkweed. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And a particular insect species cannot adapt to all of those types of defenses. So they pick one or two plant lineages and they get really good at getting around those. They develop specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, specialized behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary exposure to those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. And once they do fall into place, the insect is then, it can eat those plants, but it's locked into eating those plants because it didn't spend any time developing adaptations for any of the other plants. And that is why when we bring in plants from any place else, any other continent in particular, our insects, for the most part, cannot eat them. Those plants haven't been here long enough for our insects to adapt to their specialized defense. And how long does it take? Tens of thousands of years, we think, at least that long. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If you're trying to reconstruct a viable food web and all the places where we've dismantled them, we've got to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants. And I'm going to start with our own house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife Cynthia and I live. I'm sitting in this window right now. We bought 10 acres on an old farm that was broken up. It was an old farm. It was farm for about 300 years. And the last thing they did was to mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there. Our goal was to reestablish, rebuild biodiversity on this dilapidated piece of land. Well, the only way to do that is to add the plants that add the caterpillars that support the food web so that everything else can live here. So here's some examples. I wanted to attract the Canadian owlet to our property. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. Well, that's what they look like. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. But in order to have Canadian owlets, you have to have meadow rue. It's a host plant specialist on meadow rue. Well, any meadow rue that was here hundreds of years ago was long gone because it had been farmed out a long time ago. So I didn't even know where to get meadow rue seeds. I had to get them from someplace else. I did get them. I planted them. They grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little confidence that Canadian owlets could find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't go out and check it for about a month and a half. Finally, I walked by for some other reason, and the meadow rue was almost defoliated by Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. So it was a big success. Now we have a good population of meadow rue and a good population of Canadian owlets. So we added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful yellow moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa. I did know where there was some Bidens in about 14 miles away in a power line cut. There were Bidens. So I got some seed and I planted it at our house. They grew very nicely. In this case, we had to wait a year for the moth to find our Bidens. Finally did. And now we got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the Hackberry Emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it's a butterfly that ought to be here. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. We had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find our hackberry, but they finally did. I walked by one of my hackberry trees this past June, and there were 9 Hackberry Emperor butterfly caterpillar larvae on a single branch. Another big success. So now we've added 6 species, and that's how it went. I didn't plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, but along with goldenrod came many of the things that eat goldenrod. There's 110 species of caterpillars that eat goldenrod in my area. Things like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't found our goldenrod. That's what the caterpillars look like. So this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod and hope I find these caterpillars. One of these years I will, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I don't know why people don't like it. It's an excellent plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It makes wonderful berries for the birds in the fall, very high in fat. It's actually a great pollinator plant too. Its flowers are not pretty for humans, but they're little yellowish, greenish things, and the native bees love them. And it's a major host plant for many of our large sphinx moths that are the major food source for cardinals when they are breeding. Things like Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I could attract the double-toothed prominent. Just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Well, it's an elm specialist, so I planted some elm. They came right away. American elm, I got these seeds at the University of Delaware. They were in the gutter. I just scooped them up, planted them. It was great. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, so we planted it, and the moths came. They spend the day sitting with their heads stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants that we've added to our property, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford Oak in Bedford, New York, and people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And for some people, that's a problem. They say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, it has to be 400 years old before you can enjoy it. You're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what the oak is doing for your yard, you can enjoy it immediately. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns and a few of them as 2-foot bare root whips. Acorns free, bare root whips, $1.50 each. And immediately they started to attract the moths that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed Epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a Crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So you don't have to wait centuries for your oaks to start to contribute. They contribute immediately. This is what our house will look like in just about a month. All the leaves will be out. I'm still sitting in this room right there. I show you this just to prove we're very traditional. We've got lawn here, but I put a lot of the plants back. And I noticed a long time ago, every time I add plants, I get new species of moths at our house. And remember, the moths, they're the critical part of the food web we're trying to develop. So about 4 years ago, I made it a goal to try to take a picture of every species of moth I could find on our property, just to see how many were here. I'm up to 1,035 species of moths so far, and I'm still doing it. I got a new one last night. So that's more species of moths on our property than all the species of birds in North America. Remember, we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area, we have 40% of all the moths that occur in Pennsylvania. Why do we have them? Because we put the plants back. And because so many of these are types of bird foods, we have recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not just flew by, but bred. This past fall, we saw this headline, another scary one. The Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm sure that we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3 and probably a lot more than that since we moved in, and it didn't take that long. So I'm offering this just to show you we can turn around these headlines. Don't give up. We're in control of the life that exists at our properties, and we control it by the plants that we put there. But I know what you're thinking. Oh, you've got 10 acres and I only have a suburban lot. It's not going to work on a suburban lot. Well, that's a good question. Will it work on smaller properties? Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, so 18 times less land than Cindy and I do. And they're in the middle of development. The first thing they did was to get rid of the invasive plants they had on their property. The big one was Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. And then they planted a lot of native plants. And then they put in what they call a water feature, a bubbler for the birds. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that have used their yard. They're up to 149 species of birds that have used their yard, including 35 warbler species. Now, just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards, though? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of this wall here is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she is an island. She's not connected to any natural area at all. Well, she did the same things that the Terpster did. She got rid of their invasive plants. She planted 60 species of native plants, put in a water feature for the birds. And then she sat back and started to count her birds. I got to fix this. It's 118 birds. She sent me an email the other day. She had a great horned owl. But 118 species of birds have used her little teeny lot, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock right in the middle of Chicago. But what about city centers? 82% of us live in cities. Do we have to leave all those people out? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, which reminds me, we've got a real marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed anymore. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. So 2014, I was staring at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bees, 2 species of megachilid bees. I know they're leafcutter bees because they carry their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very strict requirements. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, but they need soft leaves. Leaves of red bud are perfect because they're very soft, because the bees snip out the edge of those leaves. They form these little semicircles. You might have seen them on your red bud. Then they roll up the leaves into a tube, stuff it full of pollen, lay an egg on it, and then they stuff the whole thing into a crack or a crevice. That's how they reproduce. Well, there was a red bud growing right next to the Monarch's Delight, and I'm sure that's why the leafcutter bees were there. They had everything they needed. I'm also pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees there. Remember, bumblebees overwinter as queens. All the workers die in the fall. So when they come out in the spring, they have to do all the work to get the colony started. So they need a lot of very abundant and very efficient forage, flowers and nectar and pollen available for them. Or they won't be able to succeed in starting that colony. But that's exactly what redbud provides. So I'm pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees there as well. And then I was really rewarded. I saw a monarch. Now this was, actually saw 2 monarchs. This was 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. That was the low point of the monarch population in the East. Only 3.6% of the monarchs left compared to 1976. And this was June, which is very early to see monarchs this far north. So I was encouraged. Maybe the monarchs weren't going to disappear after all. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but they also had another species of milkweed. I think it's purple milkweed, which gave them not just nectar, but it also gave them their host plant. They could reproduce everything they needed. You know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. The High Line is a renovated, elevated railroad that had been abandoned for years. Somebody went up and noticed a whole bunch of native plants growing on their own. Nobody planted them or just taking care of them. So they decided to make it a tourist destination. And it's been enormously successful. Millions of people have or visit the High Line every single year. And this is the extent of the nature that's up there. It's a 3-foot planting of plants that people go to enjoy. This is Rick Darke. He has been after me to go to the High Line for years. I'm not much of a city boy, so I dragged my feet. But he said, you know, they're beautiful plants. Come see the beautiful plants. Well, you know, if I see a beautiful plant and nothing's using it, that's actually depressing to me. So again, I was not excited. I thought nothing would be in the middle of Manhattan, 30 feet above the taxis. But I was completely wrong. I saw all the things I saw that I just told you about in 20 minutes. Somebody's done a survey of the bees on the High Line. There are up to 30 species at this point. There are birds there. Things are using the High Line, which has made me a convert. If we can attract life to the middle of Manhattan with thoughtful native plantings, we can do it anywhere. But there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed. And one of them has to be, we've got to shrink the area that's in lawn. We've got over 40 million acres of lawn in this country, which is the size of New England, dedicated to a status symbol, which is an ecological deadscape. Talk about taking parts of the earth out of production for a totally unnecessary reason. I know we humans need our status symbols, so we'll keep some lawn, but let's cut the area in half. Remember, lawn, you put all this stuff on there, where's it going? Right into your watershed there. So there are a lot of ills associated with lawn. But if we replant half of it, we're cutting the problem in half. And if we do replant half of it, that'll give us 20 million acres to put towards conservation. We can create a new national park. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands National Park, Mount Rainier National Park, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we will have the largest national park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? We get lots of things. You get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with the natural world. At your own pace, at your own time. All you have to do is go outside. Maybe you had one as a child, but 60 years later, maybe it's time to reestablish that. You can do it without dealing with the crowds. If you go to a real national park, there are millions of people there. There's no admission fee either. It's free and it's never closed. It doesn't matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles, a lot of pluses into going to your own personal park. But this is the big one. You get to experience the natural world alone, which, believe it or not, is tough to do in a real national park. Alone. I don't know how you can develop a personal relationship if you're not alone. This is particularly important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder. Richard Luce says, we've got to get them out of the house, get them exposed to nature. Remember, they are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what they're going to be stewarding or why they need to be good stewards, they will be lousy stewards. So we're trying, we put them on a bus with 30 other kids and a teacher, and they drive for an hour and they walk around some natural area. Teacher tells them not to touch anything, and then they get back in the bus and they go home. And I'm sure that's better than nothing. But what they really has is an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If there's some part of nature right where they live, they can go outside alone, no parental supervision, let them work it out on their own. Let them take all the risks. Most of them will make it back alive, but they'll be able to establish that personal relationship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest piece of nature. It's a piece of grass with a hedge. But she discovered there are anole lizards there. She got very excited. She had this picture taken of her to demonstrate to me, this is how you hunt anole lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with sticks and leaves so the lizards don't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you crawl up to the lizard, catch the lizard, put it in an aquarium. And then you have that personal relationship with that anole lizard. Now, I don't think that Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. But I guarantee she is going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii when she was a little girl the rest of her life. And I also guarantee that's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get this book, Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. Give you dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, go to our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. The goal here is to convert that 20 million acres and then record where we're doing it so we can see the progress and get more and more people. We're trying to reach people who are not already in the choir. So you will put your information on the map. By information, I mean where you live and how much area you're going to or already have planted in in natives. And your little area of your county will light up, and we'll get to see how everybody's doing. So we're going to shrink the lawn. What are the plants we're going to put in the area that was in lawn? Well, some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? You've got the Roman arch. The stone in the middle of the arch is the keystone. And if you take that out, the arch falls down. Well, I call these keystone plants because if you take them out of your local food web, the food web collapses. Why? Because they're making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs, which means 85, 86% of our native plants are contributing, but not that much. So if you think of these keystone plants as if they're the 2x4s in the ecological house that you're building, they're essential. The house isn't going to stand up without them. They're not sufficient. You can't build a house just out of 2x4s, but you certainly can't build a house out of wallpaper. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? And then we pick any old native and hope it's going to work, because a lot of natives are so well protected chemically that not much can eat them. We want to focus on those really ecologically productive plants. And we certainly want to avoid the ecologically destructive plants, the non-natives in general, but certainly the non-natives that are invasive, that escape our yard, the buckthorns and the burning bush and the barberries, the calorie pear, I don't know if you have that up there, but the porcelain berries, all of these things that are ecologically castrating our natural areas. They're all biological pollution. Somebody sends me an email once in a while saying, don't I know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because this isn't the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're productive or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillar. So they're there, but they're not contributing to the local food web. What's contributing the most? Any one of our oak species. 557 species of caterpillars on oaks just in the mid-Atlantic states, over 900 species nationwide. That's 900 species of bird food. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that in terms of productivity. This is the role of keystone oaks in my yard. Now, so far I've taken pictures of 1,035 species of moths. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. I will. Out of the 1,035 species, 910 have known host plants. Of those 910, 270 use oaks. And we've got 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is Quercus, the oaks. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting at least 30% of our moth species diversity. So imagine what would happen if we took them out of our landscape. It would be far less diverse. That is the role of a keystone plant. How do you find out what the keystone plants are for your county? You go to Native Plant Finder and on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code and the ranked list of both woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. Oaks are in 84% of the counties, oaks are #1. So they're always up here, but native cherries are very high, native willows very high. All blueberries are native, but native birches. So I stopped the list here just because I ran out of room. It's not because that's the only powerful plants, but notice I say natives though. If I go to the nursery and I say I want to buy a cherry, almost undoubtedly they will sell me a flowering cherry from China. If I want to buy a willow, I'll get a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, it'll probably be a European birch, or a maple will be a Japanese maple. You've got to specify that you want a native member of these native genera. Because if you get a non-native member, you're going to reduce caterpillar use by 65%. We have done that experiment. These are the top herbaceous genera. Goldenrod's always way up there. The various genera of asters are way up there. Perennial sunflowers way up there, not only in terms of making caterpillars, but also in terms of supporting those specialist bees. There are at least 40 species of bees that won't be in your yard unless you have goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers. okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to attract a lot of insects to our yard, and then we'll kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming, particularly out of Europe, that is very convincing, telling us that light pollution, the lights we have on at night, is one of the major causes of insect declines. Like lights kill insects through exhaustion. You know, that moth flies around and around and around until he just drops. Collisions, they get incinerated. They die of dehydration. The bat comes and picks them off. Bright lights blind a lot of our nocturnal insects, and it keeps them from doing what they need to be doing. To me, though, this is actually good news. We have to turn around the decline of insects. You know, letting them disappear is not an option. So if this becomes one of the major causes of insect decline, it's also the easiest to turn around. Just turn your lights off, flick up a switch. What could be easier? But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn my garage light off because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your light so that it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to discover is the bad man doesn't come very often. If you don't want to do that, take the white light out of your security light. The mercury vapor bulb is the very worst, and put in a yellow bulb. And yellow LED bulbs are the best because they are the least attractive to nocturnal insects. If we switched our white bulbs out to yellow LED bulbs overnight, we would save billions of insects in the summertime, and we would also save billions of dollars because this is really energy efficient. All right, we're going to shrink our lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we'll invite Mosquito Joe to come and kill all of our insects. Just no end to the way we can think of killing our insects. Mosquito Joe is a booming business all around the country because mosquitoes are annoying. I understand that. But there's a couple reasons why Mosquito Joe is not such a good idea. First of all, he says this is a natural product, so therefore it's okay. It is a natural product. It is made of pyrethroids from chrysanthemums, but cyanide is a natural product too. So that doesn't make it okay. He also says this only kills mosquitoes. Not even close to true. It kills all the mosquitoes it comes in contact with. But the big thing is it doesn't work. You don't try to control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of the mosquitoes. Mosquito Joe, studies have shown, kills 10% of the mosquitoes. So he's not even close to working, which is why he has to keep coming back and back, and that's why he has to charge you so much. Mosquito Joe is expensive. The way you kill mosquitoes is in the larval stage, and every homeowner can do this. You get a bucket, you fill it full of water, put in straw or hay, and let it ferment for a couple of days. What you're doing is building up the population of algae and diatoms, and that's what mosquito larvae eat, and it becomes irresistible to female mosquitoes that are going to lay their eggs. They lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy some mosquito dunks. They're not expensive. This is a natural bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito. So you put that in the bucket, the mosquito larvae nibble on it, and it kills them. And only them. If a dragonfly larvae gets in here, it doesn't hurt it a bit. If the dog sips at it, or if the bird takes a sip, it doesn't hurt them at all. And it works, and it's cheap if everybody does it. The fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the Polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from a branch, then it comes out as an adult, and then it does it all over again. I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species, 480 of the 94%, complete their larval growth on the tree, but then they drop from the tree and wiggle themselves beneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. And you know that this is the way we landscape everywhere. Not only that, but the ground is mowed and compacted and so hard that the caterpillar can't get underground to pupate, which makes most of our landscaping an ecological trap. If we plant the right trees, but don't treat the area under the tree correctly, then the moths come in, lay their eggs, caterpillars develop, and they drop down and die. I am convinced this is another major cause of insect declines, but it's another one that's easily turned around. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the profligate use of cement. We know that it destroys our watersheds. And cement, by the way, is a major releaser of CO2, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas as well. Now, this is what most people do. You have a tree in the middle of a lawn. Nobody's measured how well the caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape. Maybe you have a dogwood here and then a native azalea and ferns and ground cover. It's a safe site. The caterpillars drop down. They can easily get below the ground because the soil's not compacted. There's plenty of leaf litter under there. They can spin their cocoon in. They're not going to get mowed. They're not going to get trampled. Much higher survivorship. This is where you do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. Put beds and plants around your trees, and it becomes a safe site, and you've reduced the area that's in lawn. This is where you can use your ground covers, things like wild ginger or foam flower or mayapple or ferns. Ferns are great up north there. This is Athens, Georgia, though. These are red maples. Any caterpillar that developed on these trees can drop down into these ferns, even though it's the middle of a city, and they can complete their development. So we can do much better. Research from another grad student, Desiree Naranjo, did a great job working with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest that there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. And that's good news to me. What she did was compare how well chickadee populations were sustained in landscapes that were dominated by native plants versus suburban landscapes dominated by introduced ornamentals. And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by those non-native introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, the amount of bird food is reduced by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now there's nest boxes up in each one of the landscapes, but the chickadees come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, they produced 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, the nest produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And if you put all that together into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of woody non-native plants in your landscape, from none to 100%, this is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, that's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer babies, anything below the dotted line here, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here, generously speaking, is where those lines overlap, which means you can have up to 30% of your landscape non-native woody plant biomass and still support a sustainable breeding bird population. In other words, 70% of your woody plant biomass has to be productive natives. But this is the area of compromise we're talking about. You can have your ginkgo, you can have your boxwood, you can have your crepe myrtle. Nothing that's invasive, but there's plenty of ornamentals that are not invasive. And you can have those without destroying the food web as long as they don't dominate the landscape. And to me, this is good news, because if my message was you can't have any non-natives at all, very few people would listen, because we love our non-natives. It's not the presence of those non-natives that destroys food webs. It's the absence of the native plants that supports them. So if we get more natives into our landscapes, we can tolerate non-natives. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a garden in North Carolina. Somebody sent me this picture. They're replacing the plants in this garden with native plants. This is Joe Pye. Notice I didn't call it Joe Pye weed. It is not a weed. And they're going to finish doing that and then send me another picture. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional suburban lot like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells people this is intentional. This is not just a pile of weeds. It's beautiful. It services a number of species of native bees. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, we'd be a lot better off. And let me just quickly remind you why we need pollinators. I don't like the argument that we need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. People think if I don't live next to a farm, I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crops. That's only 1/12 of our crops that they pollinate anyway, but they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. It's not an option. Where do we need those pollinators? Everywhere, including our yards. Everywhere we want plants, which is everywhere. What about this design? Drew Latham design. It's much bigger. A lot of life. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And I'm hearing more and more examples all the time of how this is working. Minnesota was one of the first. It's got a cost-sharing program encouraging people in the state to either reduce the size of their lawn or take it out altogether and replace it with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. And you get paid to do that. Pennsylvania, it's got a great lawn conversion program. You get up to $5,000 per acre to convert your lawn into a productive ecosystem. What a great program. I heard that Maryland, I think even Virginia has something similar. Florida, there's an island off of Florida where they're paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, you get paid to take care of it instead of fined because you use your property somewhere. Everybody would want an endangered species. Missouri, I think it was St. Louis, Missouri, and Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on calorie pears, one of the most invasive plants you can put in your property. Take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act, giving you $100 coupons to take out thirsty non-native plants and putting water efficient native plants into your yard. And of course, there's the great lawn conversion programs, particularly in California, up to $2 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn that you convert to a appropriate xeric plantings. They just don't have the water to support lawn. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and this is the first one. We have not considered nature to be essential. We like it, we enjoy it. Some of us even think it's important, but not essential. And that means whenever resources are short, which is always, nature takes a backseat for things that we do think are essential. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there saying, we need to save wildlife for future generations. And this epitomizes what our society thinks of conservation. We need to save wildlife so the future generations can enjoy it. It was the reasoning that Teddy Roosevelt used to create our national park system. These are wonderful places and we want future generations to enjoy them. And I agree, but it suggests nature is just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. You can live if you don't go to a national park. But this is not why we need nature. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. Second misstep is that we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this. If we restrict conservation just to areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small and too isolated from each other. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides. So what we need to do is put the plants back. We need to glue our rug back together again, not just to make biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth between viable habitat, but to make viable habitat where we live, where we work, where we play, and to a lesser extent where we farm. We need to use a lot of those keystone plants. We need to start sharing our human-dominated spaces with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. But I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody on the planet be responsible for good Earth stewardship? I have no idea. Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We are really good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers and our elders that we all have obligations towards Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, although it is a good living, but you can save it where you live. And I love this approach because it empowers each one of us. Right now, so many of us feel powerless. The Earth, seems to be falling apart at the seams, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Not so. In this case, the cliche is true. A single person can make a difference. You, as a single person, can go outside and plant that oak tree. You can shrink your lawn. You can take out your invasive plants. You can put in your pollinator garden as a single person, and you can watch your ecosystem come alive. That empowers you. It makes you, a single person, an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't worry about the entire planet's problem. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Volunteer for a land conservancy, good idea, or a park or preserve. They're all underfunded, understaffed. They will love you. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Doug. We'll have, Lyle has gotten his hands up clapping. We very much appreciate you spending this time with us. It was really great. I have to just say, from a personal perspective, I had no idea you were such a fan of caterpillars. Some people on this call know that caterpillars, that's what I did my PhD work on. So
I didn't know that.
Are near and dear to my heart. And the analogy I used to give when giving talks about caterpillars is, why care about caterpillars? Caterpillars are like the hamburgers of, the bird world. They are the thing that anybody and everybody eats. So that's what makes them important for sure. Just a few quick things that were kind of coming up in the chat and as you were speaking. And so I just want to remind people, the Swampscott Conservancy is going to be hosting a native plant sale later this spring. We hope to be at the farmers market later this year. So you will be able to get some of those locally sourced natives as well. And we'll be dropping some links in the chat as well as the Q&A progresses. And then one thing that really resonated with me as you were talking and just thinking about how we see nature around us, one of the things that we saw last year during the City Nature Challenge on iNaturalist was that when we had to pivot and kind of move away from what had traditionally been the model of encouraging people to go out and document nature, and people like to go to their local park and document biodiversity there, we were encouraging people to really document what was in their yards and what was nearby and what was within walking distance. And we had around the same number of people engaged. So we had just about 1,000 people in that weekend to participate in the City Nature Challenge. And that going slow and staying local and just really looking to appreciate what they could see in their own yards. We documented about 200 more species last year than we had in previous years. So, and that was with people just looking, digging through the leaf litter, taking the time to kind of figure out what was really using the habitats that were nearby them, and taking the time to appreciate that nature. And so as we increase those native plants, we can also build on that biodiversity as well. At this point, I will open it up to questions. If you use the little raise your hand button at the bottom of your Zoom options, we can go that way. And then you can, once I call on you, you can feel free to unmute to ask your question. If you're having problems with your audio, you can also drop a question in the chat and I will give that a whirl as well. Susan,
I see Abby just asked, where am I located? In southeast Pennsylvania. We're 1 mile from the Maryland border.
Okay, Susan, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, Doug, this was so fantastic. I listened to half of it in Shelley Park after watching the Eagles, and I raced home, and now I'm on my computer watching your program. I just have a quick question. Can you again just the mosquitoes with the I have the tablets. Is there something you do before? Do you just put water in the bucket, or do you and then put that in there, or was there some mix that you do before? Thank you.
Yeah, you want to make it attractive to ovipositing mosquitoes, and straw or hay, a little bit in there is that's the magic. Grass clippings would work a little, somewhat, but for some reason straw or hay is just great, and it creates this fermented brew that is irresistible to ovipositing mosquitoes.
Thank you, Susan. Barbara, do you want to go ahead?
I actually have two questions, but I'll start with one and then I'll come back after other people have asked questions. So here in Salem, we've planted a lot of goldenrod in our rain gardens. And then we work with the Department of Public Service. And so it's always a question, when do you cut back your plants? So we have one that we always leave all winter, but now it's looking pretty bad. And so we're probably going to go out and start cutting off all the flopping. We won't cut them off completely, but so is that a bad, when do you do that? I know in my yard, I always leave things to the very end when spring, but this is a public space, and when you get the caterpillars, I guess.
Well, you get the caterpillars on the green growth in the summertime.
Okay.
But there are things that overwinter in those dead stems. There's a number of bees that do. And that's where the field katydids lay their eggs. So they're, the stalks are dead, but they're providing the bridge to the next generation. That's why when people have meadows, the recommendation is that if you burn or mow your meadow, you only do it 1/3 every year, and the other 2/3 remain untouched. Because when you mow or burn, no matter when you do it, you're killing a lot of things. And then the 2/3 that are untouched will recolonize the new growth that comes up. And any one section is only treated once every 3 years. Now, I recognize in public spaces, it's not acceptable to have the thing. It's good that you're waiting until now, maybe, to cut back the seed heads, because they provided food for a number of birds all winter long. You notice the sparrows don't go to our feeders. They're feeding off the grasses and things on the ground. So if you cut it back in the fall, you've just wiped out all of that food. The only problem, the biggest rub comes with native bees, because there are pithy stem nesters. And I used to think that the plants would grow during the fall, then they'd turn brown, and they would contain a lot of the bees from that year. But apparently that's not what happens. What happens is they are dead and empty all winter long. And then this summer, those same dead stalks will be the housing for the bees during the summer and then the following winter. So when can you cut them back? Never, if you want them to be used that way. But one thing that we're talking about, somebody should measure it to see if it works, is actually cut them back and then tie them up like the corn stalk things, so that they can stand up somewhere where it's not an eyesore. And they might be usable in that sense. Don't lay them flat, because they'll rot that way.
I was thinking about that. If we cut them, and maybe people can take them to their houses and they can try and see if this is an area that gets flooded a lot. So I don't know if it's a good habitat for bees, because they get flooded by the tidal river.
Oh, well, if they actually go underwater, then no, it wouldn't be good for the bees. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Doug, I'm going to read a few questions from the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the first one is from Danielle, and she says, I have a pond that is lighted at night. The lights are underwater. Are those lights harmful to the insects?
That's a new one. I have never had that one. If they're underwater, I bet, you can look in the summertime. Are there things spinning around on the surface of the water trying to get to those lights? If so, then yes, you're probably drowning a lot of insects, but something tells me that it's not going to be as bad, but yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look myself. It sounds like that's just plain decoration. And the real question is, do you need underwater lights? I don't know.
All right, then the next one is regarding milkweed. And so Rob has milkweed and butterfly plants that get covered in aphids that are very yucky looking. Any advice?
That's an invasive aphid from South America. And just like all the other invasive species, it's a pain in the neck. So, if you spray your milkweeds, you've just wiped out the goal of the milkweed. You can kill the aphids, but those populations do tend to outbreak and then collapse. You can wipe them off with soapy water. It doesn't hurt the plant, and it does hurt the aphids, and it's not toxic. But like other invasive species, it's just they're more than inconvenient. They're orange, which means they taste bad. So there are ladybird beetles that will eat them a little bit, but not a whole lot, because they just taste bad. So I sympathize.
Yeah, I find personally with the milkweed in my own yard that if I catch the aphids early enough, that you can kind of just hand crush them and
sure, yeah,
move them on their way.
Yeah, another thing that you might try is that the monarchs that use milkweeds want to use. Everybody argues about which species they like the best. What they like the best are the freshest leaves. So by the time they get this far north, our milkweeds have been growing quite a while, and the monarch populations don't usually really get big until August, when many of our milkweeds, the common milkweed, the leaves are really old. So in June, if you cut back some of your milkweeds right down to the ground, then they'll grow up and they'll be nice and fresh in August. But it also sets back those aphids when you do that. Kill two birds with one stone.
That is a great tip. So Doug, I will object to dropping weed from some of our native plants, because for those of us that aren't gardeners, to me, the name weed suggests that it's easy to grow and I won't have to worry too much about letting it loose in my garden and ruining it with my lack of green thumb. So okay. I think there's some positives to keeping weed as well.
Yeah, but that's not why they get called weeds. It wasn't because they were easy to grow. It's because when the Europeans came over and started to farm here, the Native Americans farmed with whatever, they grew a lot of plants together, and it was kind of a hodgepodge. But the Europeans wanted everything uniform. So if they grew corn, they wanted nothing in the cornfield, and anything that came up that wasn't corn, they called a weed. And that's how a lot of those plants got named. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're great growing everywhere.
No, I know, but our milkweed's got a weedy habit. So,
I guess.
That as well.
I guess.
Jim Olivetti, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Colleen. I am thinking of putting at least part of my backyard into native plants. And the question I have, Dr. Tallamy, is, do I have to take out the lawn and weeds and things before I plant the native plants, or can I put them in and just leave the lawn as it is?
It depends on the plants you're putting in. If you're planting a tree, you don't have to take the lawn out first. You just dig through the lawn. If you're planting a lot of herbaceous plants, like you want a little phlox garden or something, those European grasses are very competitive, and they can outcompete what you're planting. And particularly if you're planting from seed, they'll definitely outcompete it. So in that case, you've got to get rid of your lawn before you do that. But it really does depend on which plants you're putting in.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Susan, since you already asked the question, I'm going to go to Suzanne first, if that's okay. Suzanne.
So I'm responsible for Jim's native planting, so I guess we'll find out how it turns out. My question is around encouraging our town on a municipal level and enacting some culture change around native plantings. I'm also part of the Conservancy with Colleen, and we have kind of gone round in circles about how to make this more of a priority in town, because we are the choir, and it's sometimes, not us that we need to change, but any advice you have in that regard is welcome.
Well, that's why I do so much public speaking, is to try to make the choir bigger so that becomes a no-brainer. But, public officials are supposed to be enacting the will of the public, but they're enacting what they perceive to be the will of the public. And if we're talking about culture change, that's hard, because what they're really enacting, it was what the will of the public was 20, 30, 50 years ago, and changing that perception can be difficult. But if particularly activists make it known, this is the way we need to go now. Be competitive. There are other townships doing this. We are way behind, and give good reasons for doing it. Change is happening. I'm seeing it all over the place now, and it's accelerating. So it might be easier to get some of those officials on board. Really, if they're elected officials and they're afraid that they will not please their constituents, they'll change. They're trying to do what they think is going to get them reelected again. I don't want to be cynical about it, but let's face it. So,
fair enough.
Yeah. They had the same problem with homeowners associations. They're not elected officials, but they join it. And the best thing that's happening, I'm hearing more of these examples. You join the homeowners association, you change it from within, rather than protesting outside and trying to change something from without. Then that's two tribes against each other. That's the hardest way to succeed. But if you join it and talk about the logic of why these rules need to change, it can be successful.
So just to follow up real quick, I think something that we've come up against is that we have a lot of historic districts in our area, and some of the landscaping and ornamental choices from the time period that those districts, sort of began is actually significantly invasive in non-native species. And it's kind of one of those challenges of how do you reconcile integrating the native plants with the desire to really respect the historic,
Yes, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, I have a hard time even, explaining it. So
I would compromise. We know a lot now that we didn't know back then. Most of our serious invasive species really have been introduced in the last 100 years. So there were a few back in the 1700s, but not that many. There were many of them ornamentals, but not that many invasive. So I would pinpoint the ones that are truly invasive and say, historic or not, this is like releasing smallpox spores, and it's just not good stewardship, because we've learned that that's not what you do. But then maybe you can compromise on the others. Remember, the amount of acreage in historic properties is going to be minuscule compared to the amount of acreage that's not. So there's plenty of work to do without hitting the historic ones hard, but they shouldn't be hotbeds of invasives that are seeding out things all over the place. That's just not tolerable.
Awesome, thank you. We have one from the chat, and then I'm going to go to Susan. The one I'm reading for the chat is Robin has a small water garden with 3 or 4 water plants plus some goldfish. Does she need to worry about or consider mosquito dunks? She always assumed the fish would take care of that.
Fish do take care of it. Fish are great. I mean, things in permanent bodies of water, natural bodies of water, almost everything that's in there eats mosquitoes. So not just the fish, but most of the insects that are in there are aquatic predators. It's temporary, little pieces of water, like the rut or the tire or your gutters. That's what produces the mosquitoes like crazy, because there are a number of species that will lay their eggs on bare ground, and then when it rains, they hatch immediately. So they beat the predators, and they can pull off big populations before the predators even get there. But if you have a pond with fish, yeah, I wouldn't worry about it.
Awesome, thank you. Susan, would you like to go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, I have a double quick question. One is what to do about Japanese beetles. I live in Durham, North Carolina, and it is a nightmare here for about, I don't know how many days. And I actually take them by hand and put them in soapy water. I don't spray plants. I don't, try not to do that kind of thing. And the second question is, should we embrace the cicadas?
Let's start with the cicadas. Absolutely, you should embrace them. This is one of the fantastic natural phenomena that happen only once every 17 years. Yeah, revel in it, enjoy it. Say, how great is this? It's a good year not to plant small trees in June. Wait until the fall, because they do lay their eggs in the terminals, and they can set back a small tree. But otherwise, enjoy it. The populations are getting smaller every single time because of the terrible ways we treat the landscape. So we could be looking at we are looking at the slow demise of that great phenomenon, and ignore the media that says, what a terrible scourge. Oh, you gotta, please, they just like sensationalism. It's not deafening. It's there are places in Panama though where it really, I've had to go like this, but not up here. Just enjoy it. This may be the last one I ever see, so I'm excited about it. Oh, and the Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles as adults are generalists. They eat lots and lots of things, although they really like grapes and roses. But as larvae, they're grass specialists. We have 40 million acres of grass. If we reduce the amount of grass, if we cut our grass in half, we're going to cut our Japanese beetle populations in half too. So, removing what they're developing on is one thing, but of course your neighbors are keeping them going too. But, I do the same thing you do. First of all, they only outbreak here every once in a while. You get some years where there's a lot, but then we've gone 7 or 8 years now with almost none. They don't like cool, wet springs. So you'll have very few if we have a cool, wet spring. But I go around with a bucket, hot soapy water, and they fall off. You just touch them right in, and you can really knock down the numbers that way.
Awesome, thank you. Barbara, would you like to go ahead, and then I'll read 2 quick ones from the chat.
Okay, so my second question now is about cultivars. So we're planting lots of trees in Salem, and it's a state program. It's really going to be super, but a lot of them are cultivars of native plants. So is that going to be the same? And I'm thinking of an oak, but it's just so that they've got the particular shape to fit into the space. But it is an oak.
What is it? What oak is it?
I don't know that. So does that make a difference?
Well, the only columnar oak that I know of is Quercus robar. That's the English oak.
Okay.
Which makes it a non-native oak, and that does make a difference.
Okay, so if it's Quercus robar times bicolor.
Yeah, that's a cross between our
native
swamp white oak. Yeah, we have 91 species of native oaks. Why do we need to have non-native oaks? I don't get that. If your space is so tight, pick a different species of oak. There are lots of them that are much smaller. Put in a dwarf chestnut oak, Quercus sprinoides. It'll fit in there. It makes acorns when it's 5 feet tall. Okay. But the general cultivar question is, are they as good? And the answer is, it depends on what the cultivar trait is. So if we had good columnar cultivars of native oaks, I just don't know that we do. Maybe we do. The shape we've shown the shape doesn't matter. You can take a tall plant, make it shorter, make it columnar. It doesn't matter to the leaf insects. It's when you add those non-native genes that it's a problem.
Okay, so when we're selecting trees, I should look for, where did they get the cultivar? Is the cultivar native? The source? Well, in a sense,
hybrids are one thing, but straight species have cultivars, genetic variants of the straight species. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of native plants where they sell you a red leaf cultivar. It's not a hybrid. It's not crossed with anything. It's just the leaves are red. And that's the one trait that consistently reduces insect use, because it loads the leaves with anthocyanins. So there's a red bud that has red leaves, and penstemon has red leaves, and everybody loves the red leaves. I think they look ugly actually, but they're different. We just like different. But that
what about choke cherry? Because those have red leaves. So yeah. You wouldn't get insects on that?
No, because it's loaded with a feeding deterrent.
Okay.
Green leaves, that's what
green
works.
Leaves.
Yeah.
How about yellow leaves? It doesn't matter what happens in the fall, right?
There's still, no, we're not talking about fall. We're talking
Talking
about
about
during the
spring.
year. Fall, yellow leaves are there's a lot of carotenoids in there. I don't know. You're changing the leaf chemistry. Insects do what they do through chemistry. They find their plants, they eat them, they know where they're right. They grow and reproduce based on the chemistry of the leaves. So when we change it to make it look different, it's just not necessary.
Right.
Particularly when you're doing
Gotcha.
big tree plantings. They don't have to be, 100% ornamental. Be ornamental with your perennials and your annuals on the ground.
Thank you.
Okay, Doug, there's one question in the chat about being overrun with deer and deer that seem to prefer all of the native plants we use. Do you have any suggestions?
They do prefer them for exactly the same reasons that our insects prefer them. And we do have way too many deer. Yes, I have a suggestion. We should reduce the number of deer. And we know how to do it. This is not a mystery. It's a social problem. There's the Bambi effect. We are willing to put up with Lyme disease, with destruction in our forests, with reduced bird populations because of lost understory, with auto accidents. There's some years that 1,000 people a year in the US are killed by auto accidents with deer. If that was ticks killing 1,000 people a year, you'd hear about it, but deer, it's okay. No, we don't seem to matter. And so this is a social issue because Bambi's cute. And I understand that. We have Bambi issues in my own house here. But that's what it is. It's not that we don't know how to control deer. So.
Awesome. You just reminded me I should also make an announcement before we end that for those who joined late this evening, we will host the full recording on our YouTube channel for the Swampscott Conservancy. And you can also find our previous recordings on that channel as well. And earlier this fall, we hosted Pete Mara, who discussed the bird decline and the role that cats play. You triggered it with the Bambi and the deer, and it reminded me of the cats. So we hosted Pete Mara discussing cats and some of the ecological impacts of cats. We also hosted Charlie Chester from Bat Conservation International. I was struggling there for a second to talk about bats, and we will have bat boxes for sale at our native plant sale later this spring. And we also hosted Richard Primack to talk about phenology and climate change. And so you can find all of those recordings along with a few from previous years as well. The last question that I'm seeing in the chat is a recommendation for, actually there's this one and then there's one comment, recommendation for a native bee guide. I think I have some that I can email this person later, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
For a native bee guide?
Correct.
Look at Heather Holmes' books. She's got 2 books on bees and just put one out on wasps. So she's from, I think she's from Wisconsin, but maybe it's Minnesota. There's more of a Midwest focus, but a lot of the bees are the same. It's still the best source for information like that. Awesome. Heather Holm.
Okay. And then someone, I've lost their name, but somebody was looking for information on whether or not, or if there had been sightings for lanternfly here in New England, spotted lanternfly. I directed them to iNaturalist. There are actually a handful of observations here in Massachusetts documenting lanternfly, so they are coming up here as well. And so iNaturalist is a great way to look for potential invasives because of the number of people out there making those observations as a kind of first alert for some of this. Barbara, do you have a follow-up question, or was your hand still just up?
I just forgot to take it down, sorry.
Okay, I'll ask if anybody else has any final concluding questions before we let Dr. Tallamy be free for the evening, but he was so eager to get started early that I'm not feeling guilty at all.
So I do have one question.
Oh, hello?
Question.
Hello? Yeah, okay.
Who's
I don't know where there's a hands up sign.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I only know how to interrupt.
Go ahead, Tina.
Hi. I just had an idea for the person who asked about the underwater lights in her pond, and my suggestion is to only turn them on when you have a party and you have people there whom you want to impress, and you can tell them why you don't have them on most of the time, and that will be useful for them. And but they can still enjoy it briefly.
Great idea.
So my question was, Doug, would you just do like an overview of what the book, your latest book is? So
the book that's coming out in March.
Yeah.
It's called The Nature of Oaks.
Oh, okay.
And what I do is follow the life that is on the oaks in my yard every month of the year. So we march through, and people say, well, why'd you do that? I want you to look at the trees in your yard, but particularly oaks, since they are the most powerful trees in this country, in this continent. Not as trees, but as communities that are hosting a sequence of various life forms all season long. The object, of course, is to reconnect us with the natural world. If you go out and say, I want to look for this, and you actually find it, that's positive reinforcement. It's, you know, it's a living thing you can interact with, just like your dog or your cat. It's, you know, we're following the idea that knowledge generates interest, and interest generates compassion. We've got to get these trees back into our landscapes, and I'm trying to give people reasons to do it. They're interesting things. That's what it's about.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, with that, I will close the evening and thank everybody again. And for those of you who are local here in Swampscott and Salem, we can't wait to see you not only bring nature into your backyard, but we hope that you bring nature into your front yard so that we can all enjoy that biodiversity together. And thank you everybody for spending time with us this evening.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
Enjoy.
Thank you. This was really a great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was an enthusiastic thank you. I liked it.
I love Doug.